Thank you again, those who are joining us now. My name is Ken Lusbader. I'm one of the co-directors of the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project. And we're going to be joined tonight with Jay Shockley and Andrew Dolkart, our other co-directors. Amanda Davis is here, who's our project manager, Emily Kahn, who's our project intern, and Christiana Pena, who is project managing tonight's event. Happy 8th night of Hanukkah. We really wanted to do this during Hanukkah and really recognize the contributions of the LGBT New Yorkers who were Jewish to arts, culture, activism, and politics in the city. And as preservationists, we feel it's really important to look at the historic sites and create a cultural landscape that embodies and embeds LGBT history in these buildings that we'll be looking at over the next 45 minutes. We're here to bring light, in a sense, and to LGBT history and make an invisible history visible. And let me just now see if I can advance. Great. So I'll be brief. Many of you know who we are. We're a project that was started in 2015 as a cultural heritage initiative to document LGBT historic sites in the 5 boroughs of New York City. We're looking at sites from the 17th century to the year 2000. And on the right, you can see the types of buildings and resources we identify, and we can filter them. Each one is associated with, on the left, a filter and a map. We've got about 305 or 6 sites now, totally mapped up. Each one is a mini exhibition of sorts. And you could go to our website, look at them, and learn about the specific locations related to arts, culture, activism, and so forth. We're really looking at sites that convey the influence of the LGBT community on American culture and New York City culture, as well as sites that convey our own history. So we're not just self-referential, as Jay Shockley likes to say, we're really looking at New York City through an LGBT lens. Forgive me, I'm having trouble advancing. We also have, if the map is a bit overwhelming, we have sites by theme. These are just a smattering of them. We've got about 20 some odd sites, including a Jewish theme site, which we'll be looking at tonight. We're also listing sites on the National Register of Historic Places. The National Register is the federal government's official directory or registration of historic sites related to American history. When we started the project, there were 2 sites associated with LGBT history. Now there are 20 plus sites. A number of them are associated with the project's work. We've done 7, including the Alice Austin House on Staten Island. We're working on 2 others right now, and a third that we're going to be commencing, you'll hear about in a moment. And we're also advocating for New York City landmark designations. This is the 7 sites in New York City that are designated as individual city landmarks related to LGBT history. Our work and research helped advocate and have the Landmarks Commission make these individual designations. And I wouldn't be anywhere without our robust social media. So if you don't know about us, follow us on social media or look at our website. It has a wealth of information. We like to think that we're a starting point for people who want to do research and learn about the history. We're not just looking at tangible place-based heritage related to LGBT sites. We're looking at the intangible benefits of these sites that they convey to people, such as pride, continuity of history, and a sense of identity and a past that will inform people on how to take care of future and current pushbacks of LGBT rights. So for tonight's theme, we're looking at Jewish New Yorkers, and honoring those Jews who have contributed to arts and culture. In New York, Jewish immigrants arrived in the city in the mid-19th century and earlier. In particularly, there were large waves from Eastern Europe beginning in 1881. LGBT New Yorkers mostly descended from working class immigrant families and made a profound impact on the American art scene, LGBT activism, and religious life. This presentation will provide a tour associated with Jewish New Yorkers, many of whom have influenced art, culture, and activism. And it's interesting to note that many members and leaders of LGBT liberation movements are Jews. Jews participated in social justice. The Jewish participation in social justice has been prominent throughout history. For many first and second generation Jews, many who were raised in progressive households where there was a commitment to social justice and a link for the fight for LGBT rights as part of a national and global struggle of oppressed minorities. Many people were raised in progressive houses, as I said, where they discussed oppressed. It was an intersection of being an American and a Jew to look at those oppressed as part of their Judaism and make wrong rights. So this is really a wonderful way to see that intersection of early 20th century and mid 20th century Jews. It's also interesting to note that so many people documenting LGBT history themselves are Jews, going back from Jonathan Ned Katz, who in the 1970s created the Gay Almanac, Lillian Faderman, Martin Duberman, Leslie Feinberg, Eric Marcus and his Making Gay History podcast, and both Andrew and myself and Amanda and Emily. And by the end of this presentation, we are having Jay Shockley be an official bar mitzvah. So we will hopefully hear from Jay and he will be a fountain pen soon. So I'm gonna lead off here with some of the sites related to early 20th century LGBT life and activism. And all of these are sites with Jewish people. So the first is the Henry Street Settlement, which was established in 1893 by public health nurse and progressive reformer Lillian Wald. She founded the settlement to provide no-cost medical services to poor immigrants living in cramped tenements on the Lower East Side. The settlement relocated to this location in 1895, and it developed into a major Lower East Side institution serving community as a community center, educational place, and offering cultural offerings. And just, I apologize, I'm having this problem advancing my own slides here. The workers at Henry Street lived or settled in the building and were able to establish careers separate from traditional household roles expected of middle-class women. This is an image on the left of Lillian Wald herself, and on the right, obviously, is an image of one of the classroom settings. Wald had relationships with other women who lived at Henry Street, as well as with a number of wealthy patrons. And according to Blanche Wiesen Cook, the details, I'm quoting here, the details we have make it abundantly clear that Lillian Wald lived in a homosocial world that was also erotic. Her primary emotional needs and desires were fulfilled by women. Henry Street continues to serve as a community center, providing classes and cultural experiences at this location. And I'm happy to say that we recently received a federal grant for another National Register nomination, and we will be working on that at the beginning of early next year. I'm now going to advance to, if I can get my own clickers, to Eve Adams Tea Room. This was located on McDougal Street, just south of Washington Square. Eve Adams was a popular after-theater club run by Polish-Jewish lesbian immigrant Eva Kochover from 1925 to 1926. There are no photographs that we have found of her, so there's no other image of her. There's a lot of images on the web that are not her, so we don't want to publicize that. By 1920s, the village had become one of the first neighborhoods in New York that allowed and gradually accepted an openly gay and lesbian presence. And this was located a few doors down from the Provincetown Playhouse. The tea room allegedly had a sign that read, "Men are admitted but not welcome." After a police raid, Kochover was convicted of obscenity for her collection of short stories, Lesbian Love, and as well as for disorderly contact, and she was deported. And she returned to Europe and was eventually settled in France, where she was detained in 1943 and later murdered at Auschwitz. There's a street in Paris named in honor of her as well. Now, jumping forward a few years, this is in November 1930, Magnus Hirschfeld arrived in New York to begin a 3-month tour where he stayed at the Hotel New Yorker. He was billed as Germany's Einstein of sex, and he stayed in the 40th floor of the recently opened building. Hirschfeld, who was a gay German Jewish physician and sexologist, is considered one of the greatest pioneers of LGBT rights of the early 20th century, and as an early and outspoken advocate of sexual minorities. In 1897, Hirschfeld co-founded a group to advocate for homosexual and transgender rights. And in 1919, he opened the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin, which was the first sexology institute in the world. Unfortunately, the institute, his library, and the archives were destroyed by the Nazis. However, when asked why he stayed at the Hotel New Yorker on the top floor, he stated, "Because towers reaching to heaven seem to me the very symbol of the America I love and her high aspirations." And due to the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany, his tour was extended throughout the US. He prolonged the tour, eventually settling in Switzerland in 1932, never returning to Germany, and he relocated to France, where he died in 1935. I'm now going to pitch it over to Andrew, who's going to be discussing sites of arts and culture.
Thank you, Ken. So let's go right to the next one. So the first site that we're going to be, Jews have been heavily involved in arts and culture in New York, as we'll see. And I think that this is something that for any of you who go to the theater or to the dance are well aware of. So our first site is the Apollo Theater on 42nd Street. This building shares the entrance between two theaters, the Times Square and the Apollo. The Apollo's entrance was on the left, and like a lot of the theaters with entrances on 42nd Street, the actual body of the theater itself was on 43rd Street. And the reason that this is significant to us is that in 1923, The God of Vengeance opened here. This was the first lesbian love scene on Broadway. This was a Yiddish play written by Sholem Asch in 1906. And it's about a Jewish brothel owner who's very protective of his daughter, and his daughter has a lesbian affair with one of her father's prostitutes. It premiered in the Yiddish version in 1907 in New York, and then was translated, and in 1922, it premiered in English at the Provincetown Playhouse. And then on February 19th, 1923, the Broadway production at the Apollo Theater opened and caused extraordinary controversy. One critic said, "A more foul and unpleasant spectacle has never been seen in New York." And the Society for the Suppression of Vice lodged a complaint against the play, and there was a significant move to have the play closed that was led by Rabbi Joseph Silberman, who was the rabbi at Temple Emmanuel. Adolph Ochs, the owner of the New York Times, thought that it was immoral, and a grand jury indicted not only the producer, but the entire cast of the play was indicted for presenting an obscene, indecent, immoral, and impure theatrical production. And at trial, the producer and the star, Rudolf Schildkraut, who you see on the left here, were convicted. And the ACLU took up the appeal, and eventually they were exonerated. I was lucky enough to see the production of The God of Vengeance that the Williamstown Theater Company did in 2002 with Ron Liebman. And if this story sounds familiar to you, it's because in 2015, Paula Vogel's play Indecent, which tells this story of The God of Vengeance, opened off Broadway, and in 2017, it moved to the Court Theater. Next, please. One of the key figures in the musical life of America in the mid-20th century was Aaron Copland. And Copland lived at the Hotel Empire from 1934 to 1947 at the height of his career in a 10th floor studio furnished with a piano. He also had a loft nearby where he would often go and work. It was while living here that he wrote fanfare for The Common Man, Appalachian Spring, Billy the Kid, Rodeo, basically establishing what has come to be known as the American sound. He was born in Brooklyn. He was very close friends with Leonard Bernstein. Bernstein was really a mentor to Copeland. They were briefly lovers, and Copeland, of course, made a tremendous impact on the cultural life of America. Next, please. So we have the Ethel Barrymore Theater here as our kind of representative for Lorenz Hart. Lorenz Hart was born in New York. He was born in Harlem, and became one of the great lyricists working with Richard Rodgers in the 1920s, particularly in the 1920s and 1930s. The Hart had a very difficult time with being gay, and he said, that being Jewish, homely, and gay were three things that made life difficult for him in many ways, he thought. And it's interesting, if you're familiar with the lyrics by Hart from Babes in Arms or Boys from Syracuse or Connecticut Yankee or others that have been produced by encores, there's never a romantic love song. He never really had a love affair, and his love songs often have a sort of cynical edge to them. And at the Ethel Barrymore was where he's probably Rodgers and Hart's most radical musical, Pal Joey, opened in 1940. So it's our representative for Hart. We have not put a site up yet for Hart on our website, but we hope to do that. We hope to do that soon. Next. So Broadway, of course, is just filled with both LGBT individuals, and lots of whom were Jewish. And we've chosen the Winter Garden Theater to represent this next because West Side Story was almost entirely a gay and Jewish affair. If you look at the photo on the right, all the people that are dressed in white are gay men. From left to right, the lyricist Stephen Sondheim, the librettist Arthur Lawrence, the composer Leonard Bernstein, and the director and choreographer Jerome Robbins. And on top of that, the costume designer Irene Sharaff and the lighting designer Jean Rosenthal were both Jewish lesbians here. So you have to ask the question, what was it about being both gay and Jewish that led to the creation of this extraordinary work? And is it that these theater people linked with the discrimination and oppression that are evident in the story of West Side Story? One of the things that we love about writing up our entries, actually, if you could go forward, is that we can link one entry to another. So besides having the entry for the Winter Garden Theater, we also have the entry for Leonard Bernstein at the Osborne Apartments on 57th Street, diagonally across the street from Carnegie Hall. Bernstein moved into a fourth floor apartment, apartment 4B in 1952. And he also rented a third floor studio where he often worked. And it was while living here that he wrote Wonderful Town and Candide and West Side Story, his three great Broadway musicals, and the score for the movie On the Waterfront. And in 1958, he was appointed to the New York Philharmonic, and he moves out of the Osborne and moves into the Dakota. As you know, probably, that Bernstein was married. And when he was about to get married, he told his then impending wife that he was gay, and she was okay with it as long as he didn't make a public spectacle of it. But as Arthur Lawrence said, Bernstein was a gay man who got married. He wasn't conflicted about it at all. He was just gay. Next, please. Mm-hmm. And we also have an entry for Jerome Robbins. This is Jerome Robbins' house at 117 East 81st Street that he purchased in 1966. Robbins was one of the most influential choreographers of the 20th century. He began his career as a dancer on Broadway, and he also danced at American Ballet Theater and in New York City Ballet. And he really came to notice in 1944 when he choreographed Fancy Free, the ballet, which is still done today by both ABT and New York City Ballet. and is probably most famous for choreographing and sometimes directing musicals such as On the Town, which was adapted from Fancy Free, The King and I, with its famous Small House of Uncle Thomas, and most importantly for our evening theme tonight, Fiddler on the Roof. And it was with the royalties from these Broadway musicals that he was able to buy the East 81st Street house. And while living here in 1969, he leaves Broadway and goes back to becoming a choreographer at City Ballet. And it was during this period when he choreographs Dances at a Gathering, the Goldberg Variations, and other really important ballets of the second half of the 20th century. And you can see him here sort of figuring out the steps to one of his ballets. And he lived there until he died. Next, please. And also we have a site for Arthur Lawrence. Lawrence lived on St. Luke's Place in Greenwich Village, as you can see the entrance to his house. And this is an example of our giving another layer of interpretation to sites. This is a row of houses that's often figured on house tours for its architecture, but it also has layers of social history as well. Lawrence was born in Flatbush in 1917 as Arthur Levine. During World War II, he was a writer of propaganda scripts for radio and was stationed actually here in New York. And he said of his time during the war, everything was rationed except the two things everyone wanted most, sex and booze. The city reeked of sex. I whirled in a blender of sex and booze. After the war, he went out to Hollywood. He wrote the script for Rope, which starred his lover at the time, Farley Granger. And then he comes back to New York. He was blacklisted. He travels in Europe, comes back to New York. He wrote the play Time of the Cuckoo, and then gets involved with musicals, writing the books to both Fiddler on the Roof and Gypsy. And in 1960, with the royalties from West Side Story, I'm sorry, Fiddler on the Roof, I meant West Side Story and Gypsy. With the royalties from West Side Story, he buys 9 St. Luke's Place. Okay, so we're going to move away from theater, and we're going to look at, just one other thing I want to mention is that we also can use the fact of West Side Story to tell other stories at this theater. So first of all, this is Irene Sharaff, the costume designer, who deserves a lot of credit for the look of West Side Story. Can I have the next, please? But we also get to look at other theater that has occurred here. Wonderful Town, which is by Bernstein. Mame, which was written by Jerry Herman, who grew up in a middle-class Jewish household. Follies, a Sondheim musical, and Funny Girl, which was directed by Michael Bennett. Has costumes by Irene Sharaff. Follies was directed and choreographed by Michael Bennett. So other gay and lesbian individuals figure in many, many different ways in the Broadway theaters. Okay, now we're going to move away from theater. This East 2nd Street house tenement was the home to Allen Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky. Ginsberg, of course, one of the great Beat generation writers and poets, and the roots of this were at Columbia, where Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs and others established this sort of Beat literature and poetry world. He moves to Greenwich Village, and in 1953, Ginsberg met what he referred to as my lifelong love, Peter Orlovsky, who was also a poet, and you see the two of them on the right. And in 1958, they moved to East 2nd Street, where they lived until 1961. Ginsberg and Orlovsky lived in lots of different addresses. And so we had to choose what was the address where we really wanted to celebrate them. And we chose this address because it was here where he wrote his most important long poem, Kaddish, which was written in memory of his mother. And in this poem, Kaddish, and in Howl, another major work by Ginsberg, have gay content in them. So we thought this was the building where we should really recognize Ginsberg and Orlovsky. Next, please. Also in Greenwich Village is the home and studio of Maurice Sendak. Sendak was born in Brooklyn and becomes probably the most important 20th century children's book illustrator. And he kind of single-handedly wrenches children's picture books out of the kind of safe world of the nursery and the nursery rhyme into stories about the depths of the psyche. He had done window displays for F.A.O. Schwartz, and then he was so-called discovered by an editor at Harper's Magazine and becomes quite successful. And he moves into the basement and ground floor apartment on this 9th Street building in 1962. And it was here in 1963 where, while living here, that he writes Where the Wild Things Are, which won the Caldecott Medal, which is the highest award in children's book illustration. And he worked on many other books while he lived here, and he did 3 animated films for Sesame Street. In 1970, the New York Times wrote an article which refers to, quote, Sendak as a 42-year-old bachelor who lives with his, quote, friend, a psychoanalyst, Eugene Glenn. They were actually life partners for 50 years. But the issue of gay men writing children's literature was so controversial that he kept this hidden through his entire life. And he moves in 1972. They moved to Connecticut. So he lived here from 1970 to 1972. So I am going to hand this back to Ken, who's going to talk about activism.
Oh, sorry. And here's a picture of Sendak in the apartment.
There's Sendak and Where the Wild Things Are, a book I'm sure all of you know.
So as Andrew said, I'm going to be covering activism, and many of the locations that we've identified are not architectural gems, but are cultural and historic important sites. So this is the childhood home of gay rights pioneer Frank Kameny in Richmond Hills, Queens. He lived here from 1925 to 1948. And as a child, he was very precocious and decided he wanted to become an astronomer. He went to Harvard, obtaining his doctorate in astronomy, and was living in Washington by the mid-1950s. In 1957, he was fired by the federal government because he was gay. There was an arrest that was on his record. They found out from San Francisco. He was fired. This was during the period of the Lavender Scare. The Lavender Scare was an executive order by Eisenhower in 1953 that barred thousands of lesbian and gays applicants for federal employment, and it eventually resulted in the dismissal of 5,000 people from the government. You could see Kameny in the center here holding a sign. He became a chief strategist for the LGBT rights movement for over 2 decades. He fought this dismissal, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. It eventually wasn't until 1975 that they lifted the ban on the employment of gay and lesbian employees. Kameny also founded the Mattachine Society of Washington, D.C. The Mattachine Society was an organization from California that was established in 1950 for gay men, pretty much for the sole purpose of fighting for rights and employment opportunities. He founded that organization in '61. He also founded the East Coast Homophile Organizations in 1963, which was a collection of these various homophile organizations around the country. He was instrumental in establishing the annual reminders, and that's what the images in the center, that's in Philadelphia. They were held on July 4th, 1965, every year on July 4th to 1969, right after Stonewall, in front of Independence Hall in Philadelphia. It's incredibly brave and amazing that these individuals were so public in their activism. And he became the first openly gay person to run for Congress in 1977. Kameny is credited with coining the term "gay is good," and you could see him here in 2009 with President Obama when Obama extended benefits for federal same-sex, I should say, for federal benefits for same-sex employees. This last image here is of him marching in 1970 in the first Pride Parade, marching up 6th Avenue. We're now going to shift to 1970. This is the location of what became known as the Lavender Menace action. It was a group of lesbians that, including the radical lesbians and women from the Gay Liberation Front and other lesbian feminist groups, that coordinated a well-organized hijacking of the Second Congress to Unite Women. And it took place at this public school on West 17th Street between 8th and 9th Avenues. Hold on for a second as I advance. Many of the participants were Jewish women, including in this photograph, you could see Carla J, Martha Shelley, Eileen Broidy. We're trying to track down and confirm if others were Jewish as well. This action largely led to NOW's resolution to support lesbians in 1971 and increase visibility for an awareness about lesbian issues nationwide. The Lavender Menace action demanded in front of hundreds of women that now the National Organization of Women accept lesbianism as an integral part of the women's liberation movement. And basically what they did, they infiltrated the meeting and stood up at a certain point before the plenary, 17 women standing there with the t-shirt Lavender Menace, and others in the audience pulled off their shirts and revealed the Lavender Menace t-shirt. And if we just go back here, that is the actual t-shirt. It's at the Lesbian Her Story archive. And the term Lavender Menace was something that Betty Friedan said in 1969 regarding what she felt was the negative implications of the women's movement having lesbians, because she was afraid of them being perceived as man-haters and a bunch of dykes. But this really was a pivotal point in getting lesbian recognition. The actual following 2 days, it circumvented their planning, and they became workshops that created a resolution that now accepted by the end of this Congress. Again, this rather unassuming home is in Corona, Queens. This was the location of where PFLAG was founded. It was the home of Jeanne and Jules Manford, important allies of the LGBT community, and their 2 children, including Morty Manford, their son. Morty, who you'll hear about in a bit, was a veteran of the 1969 Stonewall Uprising, an LGBT rights activist, and one-time president of the Gay Activists Alliance. Jeanne was a school teacher who gathered public attention in 1972 after she wrote a letter to the New York Post expressing her outrage for the police for failing to protect her son at one of the GAA, Gay Activists Alliance demonstrations. She wrote in the letter, "I have a homosexual son and I love him." The next 2 months later, she marched in the Pride Parade, which became known as the Pride Parade, with a sign that you could see here, "Parents of gays unite in support for our children." So many people came up to Jules and Jeanne saying, "Please, you have to do something to help our parents." And she formed the Parents of Gays, POG, in 1973. They met at the house there. They also met in Greenwich Village, but that group, POG, morphed into what we know now as PFLAG. And eventually in 2014, the street where the house is located was named Jeanne, Jules, and Morty PFLAG Way. The Lesbian Her Story archive had its beginnings in someone's apartment. This is the apartment 13A in this apartment building at Broadway and 92nd Street, was the first location of the Lesbian Her Story archives between 1974 and 1993. It was housed in the residence of Joan Nestle and her then partner, Deb Adele. The Lesbian Her Story archives was founded by Nestle, Adele, Julia Stanley, Celu Cavallari, and Pamela O'Lean. And Mabel Hampton, seen here in the photograph, was also a very important early member. Seated in this photograph is Judith Schwartz, but the Lesbian Her Story archives is considered one of the most important collections by and about lesbians and their communities. It came out of a small group of women who were members of the Gay Academic Union in the 70s, and they were very upset about the longstanding need to have more lesbian history and culture. And at this apartment for 15 years was At Home with the Archives, a gathering that took place with well-known lesbians and photographers and writers. The archive took over the apartment so much that they eventually had to find a new location in Park Slope. They moved there in 1993, relinquishing the space back to Nestle, who lived there till 2002. And there's a wonderful documentary called The Archivist that came out about 1.5 years ago that profiles the history of the archive. And then we're jumping to another residential building at 2 Fifth Avenue in Greenwich Village. At Fifth Avenue, just north of Washington Square Park. This has been home to Larry Kramer and Edie Windsor, who have made impacts in activism, health, theater, and literature. Kramer lived here for more than 3 decades until his recent death. He helped catalyze the response to the AIDS epidemic as a co-founder of Gay Men's Health Crisis, which was founded in his living room. Kramer was also instrumental in founding ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, and that was founded in response to Kramer's anger, in a sense, of GMHC's and the gay community's tepid response to the devastation of the epidemic. His literary achievements as playwright include The Normal Heart in 1985, as well as author of numerous books and plays. He lived in the building, I should say Ed Koch also lived in this building, and this wonderful anecdote that Kramer kept on berating Ed Koch, and the co-op board insisted that he not speak to Koch directly. So there is anecdote that he would be in the mailbox area and see Koch and tell his dog in a loud voice, "That's the man that killed all of Daddy's friends," which is rather poignant and sad, but true. The building was also the location of Edie Windsor and her wife, Thea Spire. They moved here in the 1970s. Windsor was the lead plaintiff in the Supreme Court, a case which overturned Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act. When Thea Spire died in 2009, Windsor was hit with a $363,000 estate tax since the federal government did not recognize their marriage in New York State. So had they recognized the marriage at a federal level, they would have had a spousal deduction, which would have amounted to no estate tax. So she fought back. This went to the Supreme Court. The case was argued by Roberta Kaplan, another lesbian who's gay, who lives in Greenwich Village, and she won. And the IRS returned her money, and this was followed by the more expansive case, which ruled that same-sex couples have the constitutional right to marry, and that case was argued in 2015. In 2016, Windsor, who was an active member of Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, married Judith Kasner and lived in the building until she died in 2016. And it's also where Bella Abzug lived as well. So I'm going to hand it now over back to Andrew, and we're going to be talking about gathering spaces.
So we're going to start by looking at early LGBT synagogues. This is the former Spencer Memorial Church in Brooklyn Heights, and this is where the House of David and Jonathan was established in 1970, and is thought to be the first gay synagogue ever. It only met for 6 weeks in November and December 1970. It had about 35 members. And under Rabbi Herbert Katz, Katz turned out to apparently to be a somewhat controversial figure. So the congregation didn't last very long, but Katz said that homosexuality in the Jew is perfectly acceptable. There is nothing wrong when you love if you love dearly and cherish. Which was really way ahead of his time to place religion and homosexuality together in that way. A number of the early people who went to the House of David and Jonathan became founders of Beit Simchat Torah. The building, the Spencer Church, was also home to the Gay Alliance of Brooklyn for about 2 or 3 years in the early 1970s, and this was a early LGBT rights group in Brooklyn with a lot of Jewish founders and members, and met in the sanctuary and undertook political work and community work and meetings and dances. It had a women's caucus. And so this was a really important center for early LGBT activism in Brooklyn. The failure of the House of David and Jonathan led to the idea of really forming a Jewish synagogue. And in 1973, an Indian, Jacob Gube, who was from India, put an ad in the Village Voice for a Shabbat service, and 15 people showed up, and they met in the parish building of Holy Apostles on 9th Avenue. That's the little building to the right in this image. And it very rapidly grew as more and more people heard about what became Congregation Beit Simchat Torah. And it was the second permanent synagogue congregation, LGBT congregation in the United States, after one that was founded in Los Angeles. The services became so popular that in 1975, they moved to West Beth in the West Village. So they were at Church of the Holy Apostles for 2 years, and they moved to West Beth. And then the congregation continues to grow. And in 1977, they moved into a larger space at West Beth, the commercial space on the ground floor. And they remained here until 2016. In 1992, Sharon Kleinbaum, whom you heard from earlier, became the first rabbi of the synagogue. And by 1998, the congregation had grown so large that they could no longer fit into the sanctuary at West Beth. So ironically, they moved back to the Church of the Holy Apostles for their Friday night services, but this time they met in the church sanctuary. And then that lasted until 2016, when they moved into their current home in a building that they purchased on West 30th Street. So now I'm going to hand it over to Jay, who's going to lead you through other sites of gathering and activism, and he's going to finish up the evening.
Could we have the next slide, please? So basically my task as the project Shiksa is to take you mainly through most of the individuals who we've identified as Jewish, who were the sort of first generation post-Stonewall. We're starting out in Christopher Park, which most of you who have followed the project know is sort of the genesis of what became our project many years ago. Andrew, Ken, and I were part of the effort to have this listed on the National Register of Historic Places as part of the Stonewall site. It got listed with the Stonewall building, Christopher Park, and all the street beds on the National Register, and then immediately became a National Historic Landmark. In 2016, when this became a national monument under President Obama, it literally was because, again, the three of us were involved in that effort. This is just a reminder, George Siegel, who was not LGBT, designed the gay liberation sculpture. And in the next slide, which is one of the reasons we're showing this tonight, a little known protest march, which was only literally 1 month after Stonewall itself, was held in Christopher Park and on Christopher Street in front of Stonewall. The individual who's in the foreground is Marty Robinson. We'll hear a bit more about him in a minute. And also right in front of his t-shirt is Mark Siegel, who was the founder of Gay Youth, which was for LGBT people who were under the age of 21, so they really couldn't participate very much with adults, since back in those days it was very controversial to have youth and known gay adults together. Also, the woman with the glasses in the crook of Marty's arm is Martha Shelley, who we heard about a few minutes ago, who was, these three individuals became some of the founders of the Gay Liberation Front, which was the first post-Stonewall group just a month later. And as Ken indicated, Martha was also participating in Lavender Menace. So literally just 2 blocks south of Christopher Park is the first site of the first Pride March a year after Stonewall. And Ellen Broidy, who also participated in the Lavender Menace action, was one of the 4 organizers of what became the first Pride March. She also was president of NYU's Student Homophile League, which I believe was the second university group that was formed after Columbia's Student Homophile League. Next. Just a reminder that the Gay Liberation Front was actually founded in this building at the northeast corner of 14th Street and 6th Avenue. Unfortunately, it was just demolished and it's getting redeveloped as we speak. The next slide just shows some of the activities in the interior of that. This was, again, the world's first post-Stonewall gay liberation group. And it's particularly important because it led to the GLF, the Gay Liberation Front, or GLF, was a leftist group that attempted to ally itself with all of the other progressive and leftist movements of the time, the anti-war movement, women's, the Black Panthers, and so on. But because they really were not that closely attuned to concentrating on gay and lesbian or LGBT issues, a number of founders of GLF then spun off a few months later. Next. And the spin-off became the Gay Activist Alliance, which was founded in December of 1969. And it really became, for the first half of the 1970s, the single most important political activist LGBT group. Due to its inspiration, a number of GAA chapters were formed around the rest of the country. The site here is the famous firehouse on Worcester Street, which from 1971 to 1974 was the single most important LGBT community center and cultural center. A lot of the political organizing happened here, but also very famously had enormous dances and firehouse flicks curated by Vita Russo. So we did a very deep dive this past year for the 50th anniversary of the first Pride March at a lot of the actions of GAA. Again, it was such an important pioneering organization. And really interestingly, out of a lot of these early leaders, we're going to go through the ones who are Jewish. So first off, Marty Robinson, who we saw just a few minutes ago at that rally in Christopher Park. He was one of the original organizers of GAA. As I said, he had been one of the organizers of GLF, but he broke off. He's widely credited as coming up with the actions that GAA became most famous for, their so-called ZAPs, which were incredibly creative, spontaneous, well-planned, but spontaneous interactions with institutions, political figures, and so on. In the upper photograph, that's actually Marty dressed as a duck at the famous Fidelifax ZAP, which you can find on our website. And in the lower picture, he's second to the left with the Lambda t-shirt. That's the 5 men. There are the so-called Rockefeller 5 who got arrested at the ZAP at the Republican State Committee headquarters in Midtown. And they literally are considered the first people arrested for gay rights in New York City in 1970. Next, we have Mark Rubin on the left. He was a special education teacher. His most famous creation for GAA was the ZAP at the Marriage Bureau in the municipal building downtown in 1971. The upper right-hand photo shows Jim Alls, who was GAA's president at the time. They brought a wedding cake and coffee and took over the marriage bureau in protest to the city clerk's homophobia in saying that people were going to get arrested if they performed so-called gay marriages. He also was, Mark also became the founder of the Gay Teachers Association in 1974, which I believe was the first professional city workers union in New York. And he also became the co-founder of the Institute for the Protection of Lesbian and Gay Youth, which became Hetrick Martin. His boyfriend, shown here, was Pete Fisher. His most famous action for GAA, and the organizing committee is shown on the photograph at the right. It's particularly ironic that this individual has come back in the news, but if you followed Jacob Epstein just having insulted Dr. Jill Biden by saying she shouldn't use her title, 50 years ago in 1970, he wrote a homophobic, incredibly homophobic piece for Harper's Magazine. So GAA swung into action and took over the editorial offices of Harper's. And Pete Fisher was the organizer of that event. He then really went on to become GAA's official organizational historian, and he became the author of The Gay Mystique in 1972, which was one of the first published accounts of from inside the gay liberation movement. Arne Cantorwitz was the first secretary of GAA and went on to become a vice president. He was a professor from 1965 to 2006 at Staten Island Community College, where he helped to found a LGBT group on campus in 1972, and was one of the first professors in the United States to have a course on homosexuals in literature in 1973. He also became one of the founders of GLAAD, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation. Arthur Bell, seen in the chair in the middle of the photograph, was one of the official founders of GAA. In fact, the constitution for GAA was adopted in his apartment on the Upper East Side in 1969. He was a longtime writer for the Village Voice, actually started his career at the Voice right after Stonewall, writing a piece about Stonewall. And he wrote a column for the Voice between 1976 and 1984. In 1973, he became one of the founders of the National Gay Task Force. Ron Gold, seen in the photograph on the extreme left. This is actually a photograph when they announced the founding of the National Gay Task Force. He is most widely known as probably the single most influential force in getting the American Psychiatric Association in 1973 to drop homosexuality in their list of mental disorders. Alan Roscoff is still very active in LGBTQ democratic causes. He was the co-author of New York City's Gay Rights Bill, which was the first one in the United States to be proposed in 1971 by GAA, but as we know, the city didn't finally pass it until 1986. He was the co-founder of the first Gay Democratic Club, and he's credited as one of the first openly gay people on a community board in New York City. Steve Ashkenazi, in the back, the second to the left, was the first principal of Harvey Milk High School. He was a founding member of the LGBT Community Center, and he remains active in attempting to reconcile the Orthodox Jewish and LGBTQ communities. Also seen in the photograph, the second from the right, was Joyce Hunter. She was a research scientist and pioneering advocate for LGBTQ youth, and she was a co-founder of Harvey Milk High School. And next. And then finally, as Ken had presented before, Mort Manford, he became the president of Gay People at Columbia, which was the successor name to the Student Homophile League, which had been formed at Columbia University in 1966 and is believed to be the world's first LGBT university group. He did become president of GAA in 1973 and 1974. As Ken indicated, in 1972 at GAA's ZAP at the Hilton Hotel, he got physically attacked, which ended up having his mother, Jeanne, write the letter to the New York Post, complaining that the police didn't protect her son, and that resulted in her walking in the Pride March and then the founding of PFLAG in 1973. So thank you, everybody. As they indicated at the beginning, if anybody has questions, please put them in chat.
And I'm going to just thank everybody for tonight. As you could see, the influence of these individuals who were Jewish is profound, both in arts, culture, and activism and politics. If you're interested, please visit our website, learn more about us. If there are questions, as Jay said, you could put it in the chat. And if you're interested in commemorating the first Pride March, here's our wonderful t-shirt using the graphic from the 1970 Christopher Street Liberation Day March.